All right. So as everybody starts to roll in, I just want to welcome everyone today to today's SDEC session. My name is Julia Petrie from Search Discovery, and I'll be moderating today's session behind the scenes. So for today's SD session, we have the speaker, Adam Greco, the one and only, as well as the SDEC pioneer. We also have the product evangelist and coach from Amplitude today, John Cutler. So during today's session, it'll be in the area of analytics implementation, whether or not you should plan it or just do it. So we'll be having a real-time debate, and we should be hearing ideas from both sides of the spectrum. So for those of you who are new to the SDEC community, we are an educational community that is free to join. And if you're watching this session and have technical difficulties or would like to join officially, I'll be placing a link here in the chat bar where you can discuss that with me. There's also a Slack group that you can join where you can explore past sessions and post questions as you please. So during this session, if you have any questions for our speakers today, Adam or John, please place those in the Q&A area of Zoom, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end of today's session. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Adam and John.
Okay, thanks so much, Julia. Thanks everyone for joining. I know, Julia, you did that intro a little bit before the 11:30, so just to recap, we are going to be talking today about some different approaches to digital analytics implementation. Just a little bit about your co-presenters today. My name is Adam Greco, and I previously actually worked at Search Discovery and helped kind of get the SDEC going, so it's nice to see everyone again. I'm currently a product evangelist at Amplitude, and prior to that, I spent about 20 years working in the digital analytics space, so I've been through a number of implementations. I'll hand it off to John to introduce himself.
Great. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, John.
Hello, coworker. Yeah, my name is John Cutler. My background is in product management and UX research. So for the last 2 decades or so, I've been pretty focused on building digital products, companies that actually sold digital products, and that will probably come up a bit later. And my role at Amplitude is product evangelist, and that generally involves interacting with lots of customers and future customers every single day and learning about how they work and learning how they do product. And that's a bit of background about me.
Yeah. So the idea of this session, and we're going to keep this session pretty casual, is that John and I were having a discussion about the fact that I come from the marketing world, he comes from the product world. We even learned about different namings of things. Like, for example, we use the word implementation a lot in the Adobe and Google Analytics world. And in his world, he's like, well, we call that instrumentation. So we started realizing like there's a little bit of differences, but there's also some similarities. And we were having this discussion, and I said, you know what, why don't we actually have this discussion in front of other folks, and we can get some of their feedback and some of their thoughts. So we're going to talk a little bit about digital analytics implementation. And as everyone on this call probably knows, implementation is a pretty decent chunk of what happens in a digital analytics program. Obviously, you want to have data that you can do analysis on, and you can't do any of the analysis if you don't have data and good data. And usually that comes down to some sort of implementation or instrumentation. And a lot of times that takes the biggest chunk when you first deploy a digital analytics solution, but it also does take a lot of work just kind of keeping your implementation updated. So there are kind of some different schools of thought when it comes to doing analytics implementation. one approach that we talk about, and it's not really officially a name for it, but I kind of call this the prescriptive approach to implementation. And when you use a prescriptive approach, the analytics team is basically identifying upfront what are the business questions, what are the goals, what are the objectives, what are possibly the use cases that the business wants to deliver. And based on those business questions and based on those use cases, they will then figure out what are the data elements that we need. And then that will then kind of work its way down to developers who will then do tagging, either in JavaScript or SDK, and basically send data into a data layer or directly into an analytics product. So this is just one approach, and we're going to dig a little deeper into each of these, but this is one approach. And in general, with the prescriptive approach, what I've always done is I've always looked up front and said, what are the actual business questions that we want to answer? When I was in the consulting world, I would do interviews with stakeholders. I would try to figure out, what's really driving the business. What are the questions? Can I roll those questions up into kind of objectives and so on? And a lot of that work was done up front. But when I met John, I learned that there's other approaches that people have taken out there in the world. So I'll hand it over to John to talk a little bit about some of the approaches that he's seen, which we're calling the Agile, which I don't know if that's the best name, but Agile approach.
We'll go with it for now. That's good. So I think to understand this a little better, I wanted to paint some context about my particular world and probably why this influences the approach that I'll describe on the next slide. So there's 6 core differences. I think there's obviously a spectrum here, but for what I'm calling this product world or product team world. So the first is that we're talking about really stable and cross-functional teams with dedicated engineers, designers, product managers, et cetera. So these are long-lived teams, and that's important. The second is that the teams are actually the business. There's not the business and then the teams. The teams are expected to create outcomes themselves, and that will come up later. The third thing is that the teams themselves are the primary consumers of the data they produce. So the teams are the folks using the data they produce to improve the experiences and achieve key business results. The fourth is teams are also subject matter experts in the product areas they own. Fifth, they're constantly changing their product. That's their job. And so not just changing content or tweaking the IA of a website, they're actually adding new workflows, new interactivity, completely redesigning the site often. And then finally, there's a strong pressure on these teams to understand the impact of anything new that they've delivered. So that's a little bit my world, just painting the context first. So next slide. Now, what this means, I think, for my world, there's a lot going on this slide, is yes, there is some kind of initial implementation. If you're, starting from zero, if you don't have the data, you're not going to be able to answer questions. Okay, so we could both agree on that. But it's slightly different, right? Instead of trying to lock down all the requirements of every dashboard, every question you need to answer, what you're doing is exploring the business model, the product strategy. You're trying to understand, you're focusing on the key actions in the product just to make sure that you've gotten those down. You're brainstorming representative questions and representative KPIs, but you're not creating some contractual commitment with the business to produce X, Y, and Z. And then you're producing some kind of lightweight spec, a list of events, maybe even similar to what Adam had, or on some kind of whiteboard or digital tool. And then you're making some initial effort to capture those key events. But broadly, most of the bulk of the thing is happening what we might call the data-informed product loop. So going from strategy to modeling problems, identifying areas of opportunity, releasing new experiments, measuring impact and learning. So the bulk of instrumentation will probably happen over there on the right versus what happens during the initial implementation, just due to the nature of product work.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Cool. So the third approach, so we talked about prescriptive, we talked about, for lack of a better term, a more agile approach. And then the third approach is what I call Autotrack. I don't know what the official name out there is, But the idea of Autotrack has become popular. There's a couple vendors that are kind of all in on Autotrack. And the idea is that, you put a tag out there and it just basically captures everything. A lot of times in the browser world, that means it's, walking the DOM, grabbing different data elements, and basically streaming anything that's coming across an HTTP and just throwing it into the system. And then after the data has been collected, then you can go in and label it. You could say, oh, well, every time, that this looks like a button was clicked here, so I'm going to call that form button clicks. And basically, you just name things as the data is coming through. And obviously, there's some pros and cons of this. We're going to get into the pros and cons of each of these approaches. But a number of vendors, there's even a way to do this in Google Analytics, though I don't know if many people do it in Google Analytics. So those are the kind of three approaches. But before we take it a step further, there's a really cool concept that John kind of came up with and shared with me. He called it the levels of data, that I wanted to see if John can walk through, because I found this really fascinating, because I think these three levels do apply to all three approaches. And I think this will come back in some of our discussion later. So John, can you go through kind of these three levels?
Sure. So the basic principle here is that not all data is the same. So it's you had to come up with three. There are probably more, but three is good for this. So there's three levels of data. The first level in this case are things, they're critical data points for your organization that will almost never go out of style. Even if you completely redesigned your product 10 years from now, if you're in the business of playing songs, you're still going to need a play song event. If you're in the business of a project management software, you're going to still be creating projects. And so the first level is extremely stable, is extremely important. And actually, most businesses don't have that many of these particular events. Level one events are useful in the midterm for some kind of optimization effort. If you project yourself into the future a year or two, you are probably not going to be talking about them. But from the context of a product team, you might be spending a couple quarters trying to optimize these things. And so, Adam gave some examples, it might include tracking onboarding video starts or completions. So these are things that might be lightly coupled with the interface. Meaning that, if the interface changes, they might change a bit, but they're going to be lasting for a couple quarters. And level two events, what I would call is transitory or completely ephemeral. And what these are maybe micro interactions like a toggle or a column sort. You're working on a product that involves lots of tables, and you're a designer and you're wondering exactly which interactions are working to sort each columns. They're highly, highly coupled to the interface, meaning that if the interface changes just a little bit, you're almost certainly not going to really need them. And one thing about the level two events is they almost border on those kind of like cast a big net type events that you might need them, you might not. There's a really good chance you're not going to need them a bit. And one thing that I discovered working with teams is that although we can't predict the future, we're actually pretty reasonable at trying to level zero events. Teams are actually pretty good at figuring out what those are. And level one events, since they relate to people's work, they're often pretty good at understanding them. So the one takeaway here is that while we can't predict the future, people are often pretty good at figuring out the general categorization of events. Over to you, Adam.
Yeah, and what I love about this is I actually, when I was in consulting, had a number of projects where a client would say, we want to bring you in, Adam, and we want you to figure out our implementation, but we're doing a site redesign in 3 months, so we might wait until after that. And to me, that was always a red flag that they thought that the interface.
How are you going to know the efficacy of the redesign if you don't instrument what exists? This happens to me all the time, where someone's like, oh, what's your product? Oh, well, we're a project management thing. So ostensibly you're creating projects. Oh, we're going to redesign the whole thing. Great. Well, wouldn't you want to know how efficient that is before and after? Exactly the same situation for me.
Yeah. So if we think of these three approaches, if there's other ones out there, please hit us up in the Q&A, but these are the three that I've seen the most. So what I wanted to do is, thinking of Prescriptive, Agile, and Autotrack, see if Julia can shoot out a quick poll. And I'm just kind of curious, and you should be able to select more than one, but I'm just curious which approaches everyone out on this call is actually doing. If it's Prescriptive, if it's more kind of agile or self-service, or is it more of the Autotrack? So just give that a couple seconds and see what results we get.
Oh, people can do two. Okay, I was confused by the percentages, but now that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, I'm letting them do multiple because there might be people who are using multiple.
We don't have analysts on the call who are looking at exactly whether things add up, do we? That's awesome.
Okay, so let's give it another maybe 10 seconds. Everyone put your poll in there. Okay, I think we've hit our critical mass. So if we look at the results here, looks like about 71% are using the prescriptive approach. More of the agile self-service is at 55%, and the Autotrack is at 19%. So kind of interesting. We'll table that for now. Cool. So the next thing we wanted to do is go into each of these in a little more detail and just kind of talk about some of the pros and cons of each approach. So the first one we'll start with is the prescriptive one. And since I've done a lot of this, I'll kind of kick us off here. So what are the pros and cons of the prescriptive approach? From my perspective, the pro is that it gives stakeholders an opportunity upfront to determine what is it that they want to answer. They're spending a decent amount of money on an analytics product, an analytics team. If they're spending $1 million a year, they expect that they're going to be able to get some really decent answers. So it gives them a chance to voice what they want. The second thing that I like about the prescriptive approach is that it aligns the implementation to the business. So you make sure that there's a question that is being answered for every tagging effort that takes place. You're not just kind of tagging willy-nilly and end up spending a lot of time on tagging efforts that don't actually matter to the business. And I do think that there's some governance advantages of kind of having a centralized approach to here's the questions we have, here's the solution architecture, here's the data we're collecting. And from a governance standpoint, that can be an advantage. However, in terms of the cons, it definitely takes more time up front, which means that you've got to wait to get insight out of your data, which is always a pain. It does have the potential to include items that stakeholders say they want, but they don't actually need. And I've encountered this a lot. If you ask someone, what questions do you want to know about the website, your mobile app, they'll rattle off, tons of questions, but then you give them the data and they're like, oh, I don't really care about that. It's always easy because it doesn't cost them anything to ask for questions. And then another con is it basically can make a dependency on the development team that has to do a lot of work, because for many companies that I've worked with in the past, John was saying that in his approach, it might be an actual developer or product person who says, I have this question, so I'm going to set my own data. In many cases in the world I've come from, and especially in marketing analytics, it's a different development team you have to work through when you have new questions. So you have to kind of get into their queue. And there's just could be a game of telephone that happens where they don't exactly understand. So those are some of the pros and cons that I see. John, I just want to open it up, see if you have any comments, questions about any of those.
No, that seems pretty clear. Yeah, mine will actually maybe mirror some of those in some ways too. So maybe on the flip side.
Yeah, so those are just kind of what I've seen. And again, I'm kind of curious in the Q&A, if you guys have thought of other kind of pros or cons or things you've run into. Those are kind of the big ones that I've seen.
I would add one thing to that, Adam, that I was thinking that, often the real question is who has the most intimate knowledge of like the interactions with the product. So one thing I could see with that prescriptive approach also is if you're distancing the people who have the most knowledge of the interactions and how the product works from the people who are instrumenting or even asking the questions. I think that's a variation of what you said, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I have seen that an analytics team will go meet with the stakeholder. Stakeholder says, this is what I want. The analytics team interprets it one way. Then they go down to another team and they interpret another way. Then they go to the developer who interprets another way. So that's what I meant kind of by the telephone is that it could be, you end up with like not exactly what the person wanted because there's that distance between the person who has the question. So that's the prescriptive approach. So now let's kind of, John, I'll let you kind of go through your thoughts on
Sure.
kind of the pros and cons of more of the self-service or agile approach.
Yeah, so I'll start with the cons because some of those are pretty clear. You definitely run the risk with this approach for a lot of entropy and some data quality issues. So if you have a bunch of teams kind of working independently, if there's common ideas across the teams, sometimes those can take like a seat in the back, right? People don't pay as much attention to those. So you run the potential of that. The second con that I would say is similar, just distributed governance. It's you could argue in many cases centralized governments for a lot of the data stuff is more effective with some obvious costs, but so you run some risks with that in doing that approach. The third thing is that you do run the risk of people just jumping in too quickly and maybe not figuring out those level 0 events carefully enough. Certainly, I did mention that there is an implementation period, but you might rush those particular things. And I think that the final one is that, assuming for a moment that your company does have these like different spheres of stakeholders involved, you run a serious risk of potentially alienating those stakeholders. Even in a sort of product-oriented model, you could imagine a VP of sales or marketing or some other group, and they'll sort of say, well, that's all great, you all are doing that, but I'm trying to run these campaigns or do something that interact with the product, and I can't make heads or tails of the data that you have. It might be helping you, but it's actually making it more difficult for us to interact because maybe there's some naming issues or something. So I think that there are, and we see that actually in Amplitude with some of our extremely rapidly growing scale-up startups, who went from 100 people to 4,000 people, that they use this more distributed approach. And where it does crack and where they have to put, they eventually kind of have to think of some lightweight governance is in the data quality issues that span across the teams, et cetera. So I think there's a fair number of cons that you could run into with that. I think that the pros are you don't have as much learned helplessness. Often when there's a bunch of different groups trying to organize something like instrumentation, I think Adam and I was on a call with Adam once, and we were chatting with someone who's an expert in the Adobe space. And I said, well, do the developers even kind of know what they're instrumenting? And someone said, well, no, they're just given like a spec to go and instrument this stuff. And so I think, the developers and designers on the front lines are sometimes the most capable people to know what's actually happening with the product, how the data model works, how the technology works. So I think that this approach potentially, circumvents that. It gets people more directly involved with figuring out what to track. And that might cause some problems in the near term, but it builds that muscle. And so the final thing I would say for the pro of this kind of, more self-service instrumentation approach is that it's a little weaker at first and a little bit more fragile at first. But once you establish kind of business-wide KPIs and the teams are really focused on making instrumentation part of their daily work, not something that's tacked on at the end, not something that's tacked on upstream, but literally every time a developer designer is working on something, they say, oh, I'm curious about that. We're going to instrument that. I'm curious about that. We're going to instrument that. Oh, what's the KPI we're trying to drive here? Oh, it's that. Oh, are we running a controlled experiment? Great. Well, we're going to track that. If you can get that muscle building, then that's the ultimate muscle for a team in terms of results. So I think that that's like the key benefit is if you can get that motion happening, great. But the con is maybe you don't, and it falls apart.
Yeah. There's so much you said there that I want to talk to. I'll speak quickly just in the interest of time, but definitely like in my world, in kind of the marketing analytics, Adobe, Google Analytics world, like the idea that scares me the most is that like anyone can set variables because I would just be like to me, that is like a nightmare because I would imagine how many people would inadvertently set the same event multiple times. For those Adobe people on the call, like you probably have the same segment 50 times in your implementation, the same calculated metric 30 times in your implementation. Imagine if anyone could set an event. So that's the scary part, but I also tend to work more with large enterprises that had to do it in a centralized way. But on the flip side, I think it's so empowering, like what you're saying, John, is that if a developer could just say, hey, I want to track this and I'm working on this, so why don't I track it as I'm working at this? And the promise in our world of tag management systems that never really was 100% fulfilled was this dream was like, oh, a marketer could tag things anytime they want. But as
Right.
in the real world, that never happened. No marketer was ever setting their own variables. So I definitely think it could be a governance nightmare, but I'm also a big believer that analytics implementation should be always evolving. I see too many companies that they set a bunch of events and properties and then they leave it for 3 years. And that is not cool. Like you could do that with your level zeros, but you really should be evolving and always making your implementation better because you always have new questions. And the Agile approach is just so much better at that. And I think the big difference, in my opinion, is that I think the people who work on products like mobile apps and advanced digital products, they just have to be more technical. So they understand how easy it is to set attributes, and traditionally marketers have not been able to do that themselves, which is why I think most of them have gravitated to the prescriptive approach.
Yeah, I think one telling thing here is, Amplitude recently acquired a company called Iteratively. Really, really love that team. But that team's focus is on more developer-centric, collaborative-centric tracking plan management. Yeah. So yes, a marketer could say, I want to make sure none of those events with that label ever get in. But the focus on the product is thinking about version control and then thinking about how developer workflows, how they would be using it in their IDE or other things to how do you get type safe JavaScript in? So that just shows the trend that we see is that the tag management, as opposed to a tool primarily for people who don't want to talk to developers, is shifting to tag management, which is much more collaborative and versed in the world of developers. And so I think that I see a trend happening there, basically.
Yeah. So before we move on, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in my last role, when I was at Search Discovery, I actually worked on the Apollo product. And what's interesting about the Apollo product is it actually takes the business questions and automatically does the implementation for you. So it's kind of trying to combine the prescriptive and the Agile all in one. So a little plug for Apollo. But the last approach I want to dig into is the Autotrack. So not everyone on the call was using this. I think it was 19%. And I actually have gone on a little bit of a tirade lately talking about Autotrack. So I'm a little biased, but let me kind of tell you my kind of thoughts on pros and cons here. So obviously the pro of Autotrack is speed. Like it's just, you put a tag out there, boom, you start collecting data right away, and pretty much everything is collected. And it's easy. You just throw tags out there and you just get a ton of information in. You don't have to worry about developers. You don't have to wait for development resources, which is really, really powerful. However, the cons, which I wrote a blog post about this, is that I believe that Autotrack ultimately becomes a governance nightmare. I think for every hour that you save in developers, I think you might make like 1.5 hours in an analytics team that has to look at all of the different data points that are coming in and label them, name them, make sure that they trust that the data is always going to be coming in consistently. Two, I think that Autotrack, in my experience, and again, I may be just biased based on my experience, is just that it tends to be more fragile. And what happens is that if developers make changes to apps or websites, suddenly something that you've had data for weeks just disappears. And then it hasn't really disappeared, it just shifted. And then you have to kind of merge it, rename it, and say, oh, well, this thing used to be there. And in my world, if I did an Adobe Analytics implementation and data just dropped off, like it's hard enough to get people just to use analytics in general. It's twice as hard when all of a sudden data disappears and then they lose faith. And I just have seen that with Autotrack, there's a lot of catch up that has to happen, and you just have to have a lot of patience in your stakeholders. Three, I think there could be a preponderance of data overload, just like, oh my gosh, we're just collecting so much data, and like, how do I find what I'm looking for? And we see even Amplitude customers that I think are tracking like way too much stuff, and it becomes hard to figure out like, what is the specific thing I'm looking for? And then most importantly, there is a potential PII issue. And I know a lot of Autotrack vendors have tried to work to stop this, but I always get nervous that like someone accidentally tracks a phone number, an email address, a social security number, and so on. And especially with GDPR becoming such a big deal, I think this can be problematic. So, John, any thoughts, comments on any of those pros and cons?
No, I think similar, the fragility of it stands out like that. Having used products like that, that drove me crazy, wondering why I was waking up one morning and something had shifted and changes. So the fragility stands out. I think one important thing to think about is, let's say you put a piece of JavaScript in your product that tracks every URL, page view. It's kind of a version of Autotrack, right? Like you're tracking a lot with a little. Yeah. And so I think that the reality is that when you have something as potentially consistent, not as URLs, like what was the assumption around URLs? It's all going to be nice and clean, that you can do that. And you can still even see the problem with those types of approaches. And in my mind, it's also like a mile wide, an inch deep, because you're not tracking the important context about, the amount of the order or certain characteristics about what's happening. It's just like a very surface level measurement. And so that's but I agree with the advantages too. Yeah. Very easy to get going.
And a common example that I see, and this is kind of a fun little, I ended up on a little LinkedIn spat with one of the vendors, but I think what's really interesting is this, and I hear this a lot, is, hey, have you ever, wanted to track a button, but you forgot to track it initially? And now you have no data on it. And wouldn't it be great with an Autotrack that you always have that button? And I hear that argument a lot. I was kind of a jerk and facetiously came back with a comment like this, which is like, yeah, but have you also ever had stakeholders that have been overwhelmed by the amount of data and they've lost faith in your data because it's all over the place and because suddenly it started and stopped and so on? So I think, again, it goes back to this whole approach of like, how good can you get stuff up front? How difficult is it for you to get your developers? And many companies might decide to use both. We have, in our poll showed people are using both, and maybe you use both solutions. And I know a lot of the Autotrack solutions can also do a prescriptive approach as well. But one of the fun things when John and I were talking about this, John loves using Miro, and he came up with this kind of cool little chart here. I wonder if maybe you just walk them through this really quickly, this little chart that you made.
Yeah, sure. It's as simple as it looks. Value on the y-axis, effort on the x-axis. And basically the story is that Autotrack does get you going quickly. Similar to products that like measure every URL or do whatever, you get going pretty quickly. But then it basically levels off in terms of the value you can extract out of that particular data. Other approaches, maybe more proactive instrumentation, you put a bit more effort in the beginning, and then you sort of start unlocking this long tail of insights from what you're doing. So I think that is my mental model of the different kind of value props for these particular approaches.
Cool. So anyway, so that's really all that we wanted to cover. We're at our 30 minutes. Hopefully this was interesting. Again, this was just a conversation that John and I were having that I thought, hey, this would be interesting to have this conversation, with other folks and get their thoughts. So if you have comments or questions, I don't know if we will, because this was just kind of our brain dumping some thoughts we have, but please use the Q&A in Zoom, and John and I are happy to chat about, anything related to this topic, anything related to implementation and so on.
Someone raised their hand too, and there's some, oh, cool. There are questions in the Q&A as well.
Yeah, so far the Q&A is just Mitchell saying he likes this topic, which is great.
Oh, okay, thank you, Mitchell.
But if there's any other comments or questions or things, I'd love to hear if you all have kind of pros and cons that you've had at your company, or if you've had these discussions.
Eugene has a question about activity map.
Yeah, so Eugene said we kind of use Adobe's activity map and push that into eBars, which sort of gives Autotrack. So yeah, the activity map in the Adobe world does kind of track link clicks and so on at a pretty granular level. And it sounds like Eugene, and I've seen some other people do this, that also kind of push that into eBars events or SProps as well, so that they can kind of do some analysis on it.
Cool. Someone did raise their hand in the participants list. Maybe if you raised your hand in the participant list, if you want to try to use the Q&A, that would be great. One thing I noticed about this, Adam, which is pretty funny, is that these three options really represent most human options. There's some people who are like, we got to plan it ahead. We got to get everything sorted out. And then my approach is we'll just roll with it. And the Autotrack approach is like, there's no use even trying. We just might as well track everything. So it is pretty funny that, these are three broad approaches to many different problems.
Yeah. So Chris said, I tested Heap for several years ago because of its promise of Autotrack, very interesting. But at the time was aimed at developers who understood the code-based descriptions being tracked, wasn't a good fit for my analyst-centric knowledge at the time.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing about the Autotrack solutions is that you imagine it doesn't involve anyone writing any code, but you actually really need to know CSS. So the irony with that is that you're basically shifting, having a developer having to explicitly describe an event to a product manager basically needing to understand nested CSS selectors. So imagine if you have a screen that's full width and then you change it, your CSS selectors actually change. So let's say you wanted to make sure that you instrument something on both screen widths. You'd actually have to know how the CSS changes over different screen widths. So yeah, the Autotrack requires a pretty astute knowledge of CSS to work correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, and Liz had said, starting with Autotrack sometimes inevitably leads to teams thinking analysts aren't necessary. So I've seen that before. Mitchell had said, I've had to remind stakeholders wanting to try Pendo and Heap that all of the work is after the fact. It's just moving the work, not a miracle solution. Yeah, and I think it's honestly, it is really easy to sell Autotrack because it demos really well. And who doesn't want to avoid the issue of trying to get developer time? But I think the people who've lived through it afterwards, we have a bunch of companies at Amplitude who've come over to us after Autotrack just because it ended up being kind of a nightmare.
One thing I would point out about the Autotrack thing is that we actually do have customers using Amplitude that take a more collect lots of things approach. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have 700 different CTAs on your website. A developer will look at that and say, wow, I should just make a component that tracks every CTA and then records the name of the CTA, where it happened and what you did. And in one fell swoop, they capture 700. They might capture one event type, but variations across 700 different things. So it doesn't preclude you, no matter what solution you're using, it doesn't preclude you making smart instrumentation decisions that are at the right level of abstraction to avoid creating thousands of events. That would be insane. So good instrumentation matters no matter what type of product you're using. It's an important point.
Yeah, and I think like those in the Adobe and Google world kind of were forced to do what John was talking about because, for example, your organization might be limited by the number of EBARs in the past. And so that kind of forced you couldn't have an EBAR for every different element. You had to come up with kind of more of a naming convention. Tim had said, have you started experimenting with any frameworks yet for a collaborative methodology utilizing Autotrack for baseline use cases and letting that buy you time to value from more prescriptive
I have seen
proactive
that.
implementation?
I mean, if I, for example, walked into an organization that the whole development team had left, just got bought by a private equity company, there was no options whatsoever to develop anything, I might use an Autotrack solution to buy me time and then, just hire a team when I could. So there's certainly situations where that's the best and all you can do, and then gives stakeholders a taste of it. And actually, at a place even like Amplitude, we're not particularly concerned. Like, we see the Autotrack things as giving people a taste of what data could do. And then they eventually decide to use Adobe or Amplitude or any sort of range of products from there.
Yeah, and we have another comment here. We had a mix of both. Our tag manager would look if an element was tagged and everything that wasn't Autotrack, but following a taxonomy. I liked it a lot, but you need great collaboration with your dev team to make sure it doesn't break. Yeah, and I think like even in the blog post that I wrote, I'd said there's a place like startups is a great opportunity where, listen, you don't have time. So like you might just start with an Autotrack and just collect the key things. But eventually, if your startup kind of makes it over the hump, like you might want to start being a little more prescriptive.
The only thing about the start with Autotrack solution is back to those level 0 events. I have not met a company yet, and we deal with lots of companies that have more than 50 or 100 level 0 events, literally. So if you don't have time to get tracking that, it just seems like, well, there's some other things you have to work on at that point. So
yeah, and Matt has a good comment here. He said, we use a mixture depending on the maturity of product teams involved. The more mature, we shift to a more agile approach, but we still maintain the governance centrally. So people aren't adding variables, but they might be able to populate certain variables how they want. Some of this also comes to the size of the teams. Big development teams and small central analytics teams would make prescriptive challenging from a resource perspective. Autotrack makes me fearful. So yeah, and I think that's the thing is I don't think there's like a right or wrong answer. And that's what we're hoping to convey is that there are pros and cons of each. And I think that it really depends on the size of your team, how mature, and so on. So I think that at the end of the day, you know, there's lots of ways to use these different approaches. And we just wanted to make sure everyone had kind of thought about them because it's been a while. A lot of times people don't implement all the time. And sometimes you have to kind of think back to like, how did we implement and what are the different approaches that we could use? So
I really like that,
cool.
Matt, when I was doing that. I don't know if we're at time.
Cool. We got a couple minutes left, but I think we've pounded through all of the questions. So
I had one comment about what Matt's point was, is that what we observe a lot at Amplitude is this hybrid approach of a more centralized kind of analytics team with the mission of expanding data literacy across the organization and then doing lightweight governance and things. And so one story just from the last week was a team that was basically monitoring things in QA and test environments for sort of real problems, but giving teams a fairly wide rein. So it's a little bit like, do what you need to, and we'll keep a light check on what's going on in test environments. And I thought that was a really like intelligent way to think about it, that this is, to Adam's point, this is not an either or thing. They saw the advantages of centralization, but they also saw some of the disadvantages and then tried to make sure that teams could move quickly enough using lightweight tech checks and governance and test. So I thought that was a really neat story from the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that I probably should have mentioned earlier is there is kind of like a fourth approach, I guess, the more I think about it. I have seen a number of companies that have built their own internal kind of data collector or data listener, or they'll use like a snowplow, or they might use like a segment or an mParticle. And what they do is they'll collect the data there, and then they'll shoot it into other systems like BigQuery, or we have a number of companies that use Segment or mParticle or Snowplow to send data into Amplitude. And so in that case, it's more of like there's a whole data collection like feed that is then sending that data to lots of different places. So I think that approach kind of fits a little bit in the more prescriptive. I think it's like a subset of the prescriptive, but it's interesting. We have a number of clients like the Amplitude who never actually use the Amplitude JavaScript or SDK. They just like send the data straight from Segment where they've collected all of their events, which is something that's kind of new to me, coming from much more of a tag management, JavaScript world in the marketing analytics world. So, okay, cool. Awesome. Well, Julia, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Julia. This was fun.
Yeah, this was such a great session on a topic where there is no right or wrong answer. I think it's very unique to hear it from both sides of the spectrum. So I want to thank you for your time and all of your expertise, and thank you for everybody who joined us today. This recording will be within that Slack channel, and feel free to join that Slack channel and explore the other sessions. So just thanks again, Adam and John.
Okay, thanks for having us.
Our pleasure. Bye.
Okay, bye everyone.
See you.